The Islamicate Occult Sciences is, at least to me, one of the most fascinating fields of study right now, partly because it is a relatively new and emerging field of study in the wider academic world. And because of that, there's also so much new things to discover and new things to study. That is also why I'm extremely excited to be talking to one of the leading scholars in this field, Dr. Liana Saif. Welcome to the channel, Liana.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm a big fan, and I'm very happy to be here.
Likewise, I'm a huge fan of your work. Dr. Saif is an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, who has studied, well, like I mentioned, she's one of the pioneers, I would say, in the field of the Islamic Occult Sciences. She has published several books and anthologies, among them this wonderful book called The Arabic Influences on Early Modern Occult Philosophy. Sorry, that was my computer. As well as anthologies like your latest one is The Islamic Occult Sciences in Theory and Practice, right?
Yeah.
Which was published the other year. So among the things that you've studied, at least if your Twitter handle is to be believed, is the Ghayat al-Hakim. This
Correct.
really fascinating work of astral magic from the Middle Ages. And that is what I wanted to talk to you particularly about today. So just to begin, maybe you could talk about, like, for someone who's never heard about this book before, what is the Ghayat al-Hakim?
Yes, what is the Ghayat al-Hakim? That's a question that I have been grappling with for a long time. So the immediate answer is that it's a text on astral magic that includes the theory of astral magic, but also a lot of practices that the author is compiling and putting together and integrating from different communities and from different sources that the author had at his disposal. And you can think about it as, I would say, the first truly systematic exposition of astral magic integrated within natural philosophy and the most current cosmological discourses of the time. But also, in addition to the naturalization, the astralization, and the philosophization of magic that you see in the book and the recipes, it also positions itself as an esoteric project, not just an occult one. And by that, I mean that the practice of magic and astrology and alchemy, according to the author of the Ghayat al-Hakim, are all branches of knowledge that get ultimately legitimized not only through natural philosophy, but by a deliberate pursuit of wisdom, of hikmah. And in that sense, that this knowledge is part and parcel of a process of a lot of soul work that the sage needs to go through. That's why it's called the goal of the sage. So, the practice of magic and the practice of astrology and the practice of alchemy are all tools in the path of a kind of enlightenment, so to speak. And magic and alchemy, but especially magic, as Charles Burnett has written about, is that apex of abilities that a sage can master. And so the Ghayat al-Hakim is basically a systematization of this way of thinking, and it's both concerned with occult practices, but also their integration into a system or a path of esoteric enlightenment, so to speak.
Right. So it's almost like a encyclopedic work, would you say, in a certain sense?
Yeah, it's been described as being encyclopedic. It's also been described as compilation. I am a little bit careful about calling it compilation or just emphasizing the compilation aspect. That is because the word compilation sometimes indicate a process, an exoteric process of just bringing together materials and putting them in one place. But the author, I think, was doing something way more deep and sophisticated than that, where he was integrating everything that he's read, whether that was on the front of magic or the occult sciences or natural philosophy, and putting them together from the perspective of the time and from the perspective of the individual who wrote it. It's definitely encyclopedic, and in the sense of systematizing, right? This knowledge that I've talked about. Yeah.
So speaking of that, the author, what do we actually know about who wrote the Ghayat al-Hakim and when it was written and the sort of environment in which it was written? Like who is this author of this book?
Yeah, good question. Simple answer is that we don't know much about the author, but the question of the author is still very interesting, because historically speaking, so not just in the context of modern scholarship, the author has been thought to be Maslama al-Majriti, and you see that in manuscripts as well. So it's, as I said, it's not just a new a misattribution. This has been going on for a while. In fact, Godefroy de Calatay and Sébastien Moreau wrote, I think, like 2 articles, maybe more, about this historical era, where individuals throughout history, scribes as well of some of the manuscripts, have attributed to Maslam al-Majriti, and Maslam al-Majriti died at the beginning of the 11th century, and he was like a very prominent mathematician and astronomer who, a very, very important thinker as well. But discrepancies between the dates of the texts as we came to know it and the life of Maslam al-Majriti meant that scholars were eventually realized that this could not be written by Maslam al-Majriti. And it was Maribel Fierro in an article called Botanism in Al-Andalus who makes a strong case for the author being Maslama al-Qurtubi, so still an Andalusian author and thinker. And he was a scholar of hadith, but also an occultist who's had a little bad reputation, according to Maribel Fierro's article, for being an occultist. So he, it seems that he was, according to, if we accept that it's Maslam al-Qurtubi, then that puts the dates in the right sequence.
Yeah.
That it makes sense with what we know about the text. So there is now a general acceptance that the author is Maslama al-Qurtubi, although it is fair to say that although this is the best candidate for the position, but I still don't think it's 100% verifiable that it was Maslama al-Qurtubi, but that's the best informed speculation, I think, that we have. Yeah.
The fact that they both seem to have similar names, Maslama is in both. Do you think that has contributed to that confusion or that misattribution in history, or is that
Possibly. I think the confusion arose from the historical attribution.
Yeah.
You have someone like Ibn Khaldun and other prominent thinkers saying that it's Maslam al-Majriti. If I remember correctly, I'm not 100% sure, but also Haji Khalifa and Kashf al-Dhunun, I think, mentions that it's Maslam al-Majriti. And so when the attention came to the Picatrix and the possible dates in which it was written, that's when the discrepancy popped up, and it made scholars rethink that attribution. But what we know is, and the text also confirms, is that it came from an Andalusian context, but one that was globalized. Clearly, the author had access to sources not just from within the Western Islamic context, the Spanish context, but also from more the Eastern context as well. And if I also recall correctly, some details in Maribel Fierro's article is that Maslam al-Qurtubi has traveled. And so, and there is evidence of him having been exposed to different traditions, esoteric and occult traditions from various parts. So it really is a text that reflects magic in a global Islamicate context.
Yeah. I was going to ask you particularly about the context in Andalusia, and if there's anything in particular in that environment that made it especially appropriate or fruitful for this text to appear in that place. But I think you answered that pretty nicely in that there is something about that culture, but also a globalized environment, and that al-Qurtubi might have traveled and encountered traditions and figures further east in the Islamic or the Islamicate world.
But also there were interesting things happening in 10th century Al-Andalus as well. It's been argued that there is, due to the global context surrounding Al-Andalus, where there's influences from the Ismaili context that was active in the North African situation. And also there was the tradition of Ibn Masarra, and the idea of esoteric contemplation that enables one to arrive to divine truths, but also entrenching wisdom with this idea of it's not just contemplation, but it's also practice. I mean, Ibn Masarra was attributed a text on the significance of the letters, for example, but the Ghayat al-Hakim is not interested at the same time in this context, although one of the chapters of the Ghayat al-Hakim, which is, I forgot which book, I want to say the second book, chapter 4, where the author does allude to a practice involving letters, but he attributes that to the Sufis, and he explicitly says that's not what I'm doing. And he even claims to, and I've written a book about this, which I would love to find, but this is not what I am doing here, because the focus of the text is really astral magic. And in this context, you see the influence, for example, of Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity. You see the influence of Jabir ibn Hayyan. You see the influence of the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. And that contributes to what I described as like a global magical outlook. So there are different things that reflect the Andalusian context, but also the ambition of Andalusian thinkers that involved opening the doors to Eastern knowledge, whether that was occult, philosophical, or esoteric.
Right, that's really interesting. So he sort of actively distances himself from the Sufi or the Masarian group.
Yeah, he seems to be saying that that's not what I'm doing here. He refers to a mysterious text in that chapter called Al-Kitab al-Makhzun to a certain Ja'far al-Basri, which scholars have not been able really to identify. But it's interesting that, it's al-Basri, so indicating Iraq and Basra. And so, and I have not been able to identify that, but that's where the author explicitly mentioned things that you see in the science of letters and divine names, like Ismullah al-Azam, the greatest name of God. And he says that some of the muhaqqiqeen, the verifiers of truth, a name for the esoteric elite associated with Sufism, he says that they have the secret of the God's greatest name, and they do wondrous things with it. But this is a small chapter And as I said, the author does not give any details, and basically, is not what he's doing. What he's doing is something else.
I,
But it's an odd chapter to
yeah.
be there,
Mm,
and so it's not present in all the manuscripts. It's present in most manuscripts, but not
interesting.
all manuscripts. And so I do wonder, maybe that either that some scribes felt that that was a really odd chapter in the book, or that it was an interpolation, but I am not sure about this.
Mm,
But a deep look into that chapter in relation to other chapters indicates that the author was definitely aware of Sufi context, even Ibn Masarran context,
mm,
but that's not what the text is about. So it's more, as I said, akin to Ikhwan al-Safa, the Pseudo-Arcadian Hermetica, Jabirian Kitab al-Nukhab, and the materia medica of that time, Ibn Wahshiya's Filah al-Nabatiyya, the Nabataean agriculture. So it
right.
draws more from these sources.
Right. I was, not to drag on too long about Ibn Masarra, but I was fascinated about that connection because, at least according to the possible biography of Al-Qurtubi that Fierro presents, is, again, if not misremembering, is very similar to the biography of Ibn Masarra and his travels. I believe both of them claim to have studied in Mecca with the same Sufi Sheikh, Abu Sa'id.
Yep.
And also, I think both have a connection. I could be misremembering, but it's some connection to Sahl al-Tustari, or that would have been actually earlier. But anyway, I just found that the similarity between those also kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the rihla, the notion of the rihla seems to be one of the practical or pragmatic aspects of gaining wisdom. And so, you hear a lot of thinkers and scholars and philosophers from Al-Andalus doing this rihla, doing this journey for attaining knowledge. And in that journey, often scholars would stop at, cultural centers
Yeah.
in the way that we would describe them. And those were things like madrasas, things like Sufi lodges, and so it's not surprising that similar stops and similar stations
Mm.
are treaded by a different array of scholars.
Right, right.
And Mecca, of course, is the ultimate journey from the perspective of religion as well. And so, if you are esoterically inclined, maybe symbolically, at reaching Mecca is akin to reaching a kind of like proximity to the divine, which
Yeah.
was the concern of someone like the author of the Ghayat al-Hakim, or Muslim al-Qurtubi, or Ibn Masarra, Ibn Arabi,
Mm.
the list goes on.
Yeah. So if Al-Qurtubi is the possible author, this would place the text around like the mid 10th century, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I mean, I do not have a reason to discredit the author's own dates.
Hmm.
And what the author says is that the book was completed in the 950s,
Oh, he says. Okay.
after the completion of the book, the sister text of the Ghayat al-Hakim, which is Rutbat al-Hakim, the rank of the sage, which is its alchemical counterpart.
Hmm.
So the 950s makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he writes this book, or these two books that seem to be interconnected, the Rutbat al-Hakim and the Ghayat al-Hakim. What do we actually find in the text more concretely? So what is he doing in this text? Is he is it theories about astral magic? Is it more practical? Like, what's going on in the text?
It's both. It's not divided into like a bit about practice and a bit about theory. It's they are intermingled in the text. So you have practices from different communities, like what he refers to as the Indians or the Sabians, or the Babylonians, etc. So there's like many traditions. And so what he does is that he takes these practices and wraps them up often with theories, whether, and these theories and this cosmological settings, he often contextualize them within those communities, right? And so but ultimately he is concerned with placing those practices in their right astrological context, like the place of these practices as astral sciences. So he gets a lot into the place of the celestial world in the cosmos. He gets in a lot into how the celestial world influences the world below in order to understand how magical outcomes take place. And so in that sense, he draws on a tradition that arguably, you know, someone like Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi really gave shape, which is the idea that the celestial world acts as the efficient causes of generation and corruption. So the application of Aristotelian cosmology in this context, where the practice of making a talisman is akin to the practice of generation and corruption, in the sense that the magician is like the Aristotelian craftsman or carpenter, as the allegory that Aristotle uses often is the carpenter who brings form and matter and brings them together, and as a result you have like a kind of informed or an active object. And the argument is that this object becomes active and becomes alive through the influences of the stars. And this is something that the author attributes, for example, to Ptolemy's Kitab al-Thamara, translated as the fruit, where explicitly he says, you know, the powers of the talisman, or it comes from the celestial world. At the same time, he attributes he connects this to theories that are found in the Jabari and Kutab al-Nukhab, and so that's very important in the theorization. And he also places these practices within a Neoplatonic emanative scheme. So, you know, he connects the ability of the mage with their status as a microcosm, where the mage as a human is a copy of the bigger world, the macrocosm. And so with the powers, you know, the powers of the universal intellect are reflected in the particular intellect of the human being. The universal soul, which is emitted by the intellect, is reflected in the particular soul of the human being, etc. And so the sage is basically the person who is able to align their existence in all their dimension, the soul, intellect, and body, to the celestial world, and in a more inflated way to the entire cosmos. And that's what gives the sage really the legitimacy to practice this. So the author is constantly reminding the reader that this practice is an application of natural philosophy, and that the sage is the person who is able to look at the cosmos and understand it both in a causal type of way, but also in a semiological type of way. He's able to read the signs, and this way, this reflects the kind of Neoplatonized Aristotelianism and Aristotelianized Neoplatonism of that time, where to gain wisdom, you need to know the effects and their causes, but also you follow what Plotinus says in the Enneads, which is that the wise person is the person who can see in one thing another thing. So this is correspondences, but also a semiological way of thinking, being able to read things as signs of truth, but also being able to attain the truth through understanding causes. And so that reflects the amalgamation and the reconciliation of Aristotle and Neoplatonism in this text. And in that sense, it's a very typical text of natural philosophy of that time.
Right.
But that is not to
it,
say that it's primarily theoretical. It's full of practices. But as I said, they're all wrapped up with philosophical and cosmological discourse.
Yes. So that perspective, or that approach of natural philosophy that is used in this text, would that make it different from certain later texts like the Shams al-Ma'arif, for example, which
yes,
some would argue has a more sort of esoteric, perhaps, approach?
It has a different esoteric approach. I think they are both invested in esoteric aspirations, but through different paths, right? That you had Islamic esotericism, there's different currents and there's different approaches to similar aspirations. So, I mean, the best way to look to describe this is that you can be an astrologer at that time and not care about spiritual ascendance and not talk much about enlightenment, etc. And so, for example, if you read Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, there isn't much about an esoteric aspect, but according to the classification of knowledge at that time, astrology is an occult science. And it's an occult science in a very straightforward way. Occult referring to khafi, hidden. And this is an ontological category. So something, the occult sciences, and I'm talking about the particular context of, let's say, the 9th century. This is not a stable thing. You'll find that the terms start getting different meanings in different contexts and different epistemological frameworks. But in the framework of Ghayat al-Hakim, it refers to the occult sciences as the sciences that deal with phenomena whose causes are not immediately available to the senses. And so, in that sense, Abu Ma'shar was doing that. He was unpacking and theorizing the reason why the world above influences the world below and legitimizing astrology through Aristotelianism. But he was not concerned with any kind of esoteric aspirations. But you go to Ikhwan al-Safa, you go to the Picatrix, and astrology becomes a tool for understanding the celestial world in order to ultimately attain the status of the sage. So here you have an example where astrology fits within an esoteric context, but there are other contexts where that is not the case. And so, like, the difference between, for example, the Ghayat al-Hakim and Shams al-Ma'arif by al-Buni is that, or attributed to al-Buni, is that Shams al-Ma'arif and other texts like it, whether they were misattributed to al-Buni or authentically to al-Buni, they emerged from a more Sufi letrist cosmology, where privilege is given to revelatory experience rather than one that is firmly based in natural philosophy and causal way of thinking. And so you start seeing that the role of astrology becomes very different. So whereas in Ghayat al-Hakim, you really had to know your astrology inside out from like different traditions at the same time. You need to know your lunar mansions very well. You need to know astronomy very well. You need to know how to put together a natal chart. You cannot be an astro magician without being a consummate astrologer. But when you get to the Shams al-Ma'arif or letrist magic in general, astrology is used differently. It becomes, quote unquote, a little bit more elementary, not to mean less important. But what becomes more important is more a semiological framework, so correspondences. So you do a certain thing on the hour of Venus at the day of Venus, and because these are associated with this angel, this jinn, etc. The Ghayat al-Hakim does not have this kind of agency of like jinn or demons or angels, and the author explicitly actually says that. But the author is more interested in the astral configuration that determines certain types of influence. So you have to know your aspects, you have to know your lots, you have to know your houses, you have to know conjunctions, you have to know a lot of details in order to let a very particular astrological influences flow into the work. And so in that sense, they're different. The author of the Ghayat is firmly intellectual in his style of esotericism, meaning that it's not a passive reception of revelatory knowledge as a result of taking a spiritual path, but rather it's the active seeking of knowledge through causality and through symbiology that would ultimately lead you to the knowledge of the cause of all causes, the mover of all things moving, and God. So even though the esoteric aspiration is similar, but the paths and the tools are very different in that sense. And obviously, like the author, as I said in that weird chapter, acknowledges there are reference to people of tasawwuf and Sufis, but not more than 2 references, and definitely as a side note. Whereas like the letrist type of magic emerged from a context where letrist cosmology competed with this type of like Aristotelian heavy cosmos of the Ghayat al-Hakim and Ikhwan al-Safa, etc.
Yeah, and that what you mentioned about the, especially the Ghayat al-Hakim, that sort of natural philosophy aspect of it, I think is one of the best ways to show also this common, I think, misunderstanding that people associate or think that the occult or magic was practiced by the uneducated general masses. But the way you describe it is that for someone to even be able to work with these things at all, you need to have an incredible amount of knowledge about all kinds of different fields of philosophy and science.
Absolutely. That is not to say, though, that the only practice that was taking place was through just the natural philosophers and like the intellectual elite. What we do observe in the works of, you know, the naturalizers of the occult sciences, including Abu Ma'shar and of course the author of Ghayat al-Hakim, is that they were basically theorizing practices that people were practicing in the streets, and they like it was present as we know in the public. These were services that were available to the public, and the difference is that here we have intellectual elites who are applying natural philosophical foundation to its understanding, and I think looking at the Ghayat al-Hakim, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly to whom this is directed, who is the client of this text. So I find it interesting to look at other sources to figure out what's going on. So this is something that was brought up in a class that I was giving yesterday in one of my courses here in Amsterdam. We were talking about Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, and one of the students asked me like, but who was he talking to? Because Abu Ma'shar starts his book by saying that the reason why I wrote this book is so that I can show that the science of astrology, which is the basis for astral magic, that's why I'm bringing up Abu Ma'shar and astrology a lot, that the reason he's writing the introduction to the great introduction to astrology is because a lot of people, and that's his words, a lot of people thought that the science of the stars is based on intuition and conjecture, hadas and lack of burhan, lack of proofs. And I'm writing this book so that I can show that that is not the case. So he is making a point that that he acknowledges these are these practices, but what I am doing is to apply from his perspective scientific principles to it. And he makes a distinction between astrology as divination or divinatory practices and astrology as a science based on the study of causes. And the example that he uses is physiognomy. So he he says that there are the common people, the way that they arrive to prognostication is different than what I'm trying to do here. For example, people deduce the gender of the child on the basis of the way the mother's belly looked like as she was carrying it. And so, and how her eyes look like during pregnancy. But and he's making a clear distinction that this is a more like physiognomic, this is more a divinatory aspect that is not necessarily based on like causal foundations. Whereas what he's doing is not a kind of divinatory astrology, but rather a scientific astrology. And so if we look at Ghayat al-Hakim in this context, I think we can say something similar, that what the author was doing is to apply natural philosophical foundations on practices that he says, were practiced commonly by different communities as well. So, and unfortunately, with history, we end up receiving the works of those who are, who become elites in their fields. And we don't see a lot about the people who practiced the stuff in their communities. I mean, George Saliba wrote an article a while back on the role of the astrologer in Islamic society, but also Christina Richardson on her book on Banu Sasan in the Islamic Middle Ages. She talks about their practices of astrology, and she points out that they were behind a lot of the Bulhan texts. So the Bulhan here text refers to, of course, a genre rather than a particular text, like the famous Kitab al-Bulhan attributed to Abu Mashar. In also like Kitab al-Mawalid, which is a similar type of text with a lot of images. In fact, the images take more space than the words. And she argues that the Banu Sasan were using these texts not only for practice but also for entertainment. These were very visually exciting texts. So we know people practiced all of this stuff, magic and astrology, but the texts that we have been studying, or I have been studying, they definitely belong to like the intellectual and the spiritual elite, so to speak, and they were concerned with, in addition to systematizing practices, but also presenting these texts as, legitimate philosophical and high knowledge.
Absolutely fascinating. Excuse me. I would love to get into the weeds, to the details of the practical aspect of the text. So what is the author actually doing practically? For example, in the Latin Picatrix, which we'll probably touch on a bit later on, it's giving very like instructions basically on how to make a certain person fall in love with you, for example. Do we find this in the original Raya, or does it have a different approach?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to connect it with your question about what is the Raya, I think one of the amazing things about the text is that it's user-friendly. It gives instructions in details and recipes. So yeah, it's definitely concerned with systematic breakdown of practices and recipes from different sources in different ways, definitely. This is a text for practice.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you, and you don't have to answer this, but do you have any particular like examples you can share, like how you don't have to give the actual instructions, but like what is an example of one of those kinds of instructions?
Yeah, sure. So for example, you get the type of magical practices where you create objects made from material that correspond to particular planetary configurations or particularly planets, and these figures become representatives of the people, for example, that the magicians seek to influence. So, there's one for getting the beloved, and you basically create an image of yourself and the image of your beloved under very particular astrological configuration, and then you bring them together as if in an embrace. You wrap them with, I think, green piece of cloth, and you bury it in the place of the beloved, and that will cause them to fall in love with you. You also have the practice of niranj, and niranj is a Middle Persian word with a very complex meaning in its original context, which includes being protective prayers. And I'm not an expert on Middle Persian, but in the Pseudo-Arcetian Hermetic and also the Ghayat context, they mean basically magical objects that are made not so much from metals on which you inscribe names or astrological symbols, but rather organic material like blood, flesh, bodily fluids from animals, from humans. And that basically creates a kind of powerful objects that the texts seem to imply emit a kind of vapor, subtle kind of spirit. And spirit here, again, I don't mean like jinn demons, but kind of like a subtle power that acts as the deliverer of power and action. And so the niranjs are like these very powerful objects with which you can, for example, attract animals. And this is completely in the Ghaya taken from the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, and the Ikhwan al-Safa also have it. And so, yeah, you have this kind of practice. You also have some invocations of the planets. So, but these invocations, they're invoking what is described as the ruhaniyat of these planets, which kind of like treads the line between quote unquote like spiritual, in the sense of demons, angels, entities type of things, and more like the ruhaniyat in the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetic context, which are basically planetary forces. They are kind of the manifestation of the cosmos volition rather than entities. So the invocations in this sense are intended to create a space and a mindset that are hyper symbolic of the planetary powers. So these invocations end up not being kind of like, I bind you, I am, in the sense that you get in later material that are focusing on entities such as demons, but rather calling out the attributes of the planet. Oh, Venus, you who are luxurious, you who are beautiful, you who, so it's just a serenade of the qualities of the planets, intended to create this like hyper intense symbolic moment. But at the same time, it is a gray line that is worth looking into. And it's worth asking a question about, what is the mechanic then of listening? Like, what are the planets listening? Are the planets attentive? Is this addressative? And so what is the nature then of that attentiveness in the planets? But in any case, it's definitely not in the kind of like angelic and jinnic and demonic type of way. So you have these practices as well. You have more like recipes for incenses and suffumigations that have the power to heal, but also to have other magical effects. You have descriptions of rituals, like the famous description of like the head the head ritual that in the text is attributed to the Indians, but in other texts it's attributed to the Sabians, where like a boy's head is miraculously detached from his body, but it stays alive, and that becomes kind of like an oracle. That, but here the author is telling us stories rather than like the exact recipes for this. So I can talk for hours about
Right, yeah,
the
it's a lot
kind
of
of
stuff.
practices that are inside the Ghaya. Yeah.
Particularly, I think the stuff about the nature, the questions around the nature of the planets or the stars and their agency, etc. That leads me to the question of reception too. Like how was this work received in that society, and what became the legacy of this book? Like you can imagine that some of these ways that the stars and their powers are described would be criticized by certain theologians as compromising the monotheism of Islam, for example. But also, if al-Qurtubi is the author and he was a scholar of hadith, clearly that relationship is a bit more complicated. But what was the reception of the Ghaya in its time?
That's a very good question, and it seems like the reception of the Ghaya is not consistent. So if you compare, for example, the reception of since you brought up earlier Albuni's texts, including pseudo-Albunian texts like Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra, you'll find that it has a much richer legacy than the Ghayat, particularly in the Islamic context. The Ghayat al-Hakim was definitely known, and and sometimes negatively, like we see in Ibn Khaldun's famous tirade against the sorcerers of the Western world, and in that sense he means Al-Andalus, where he counts Al-Majriti as the author of the Ghayat al-Hakim, but he also has some harsh words to say about Al-Buni. And Ibn Khaldun's voice is a voice of, a normative voice. But beyond that, you don't see actually a very visible influence of the Ghayat al-Hakim on later material. That is not to say that it doesn't exist. I think the influence of Ghayat al-Hakim is huge in the sense of like, this is the text that established that you can talk about magic theoretically and through with natural frameworks. But I think that, and I'm saying this tentatively, I think we need more work on this, is that the letterist cosmological foundation became a more successful model or a more prominent model, let's say, for legitimizing magical practices more than the natural philosophical. So I think by the time Sufism was institutionalized in the 12th century and the 13th century, and a more emanative cosmos that also integrated the science of the letters and the divine name, that took over, I think, a little bit as the model for understanding magical effects, and that the natural philosopher as magician was overtaken by the Sufi as a musakhir, as someone who attains the ability through a gift from God for their spiritual practice to manipulate reality by understanding the letters and divine names. And I think that became more popular, and that became more influential. But I say this tentatively because, you know, biobibliographical sources and do mention the Ghayat al-Hakim.
Yeah.
So it was still known, it was still acknowledged, but I think, yeah, the letterist context takes over.
Yeah.
And also, in the 13th century, we also see before, like there's before the boom in letterist magic, we also see a point where astral magic shifts and opens way to more to practices that are more influenced by Jewish traditions of magic. We see that in al-Sakkaki's السر المكتوم sorry al-Sakkaki's البحر الشامل, and we also see that الكتاب الشامل, sorry, and we also see that in فخر الدين الرازي's الكتاب المكتوم السر المكتوم, and that is in the 13th century, where we start seeing a shift from the ruhaniyat, the kind of celestial ruhaniyat, who are a little bit, who are more celestial forces than spiritual forces. We start seeing the influence of the Jewish regimentation of angelic orders and the jinn orders that are bound to these angelic hierarchies. We start seeing that becoming more of the agent. So I think there was a general shift from a natural philosophical foundations to more letterist and Sufic cosmos, while also the influences of the Jewish material. Because we see, for example, evidence of that, as I said, in al-Sakkaki, that is currently being studied by a group of scholars under the leadership of Emily Salov in Exeter, and there will be a book published soon, and I've written a contribution exactly on the subject of like the impact of Jewish practices and the regimentation of angelic orders on that material. So I think these led to a real shift in the foundations, the epistemological foundations of magic. But that meant that the Picatrix became more influential in the European context when it got translated into Latin in particular, and the legacy there is definitely more evident, and that's what I talk about a lot in my first book.
Yes, it almost, in some ways, it reminds me of the situation with Ibn Rushd, which, you know, who is also from Andalusia, but his legacy is significantly stronger in the European scholastic context than it is in the actual Islamic world. And this seems to be a similar situation with the Ghayat, perhaps, because
I think so. Yes,
it is indeed translated into Latin as the Picatrix, which becomes, at least as I understand it, one of the most famous and widely used magical like books in all of history, at least in Europe.
Yeah, because it solved a problem. Here we have a magic that does not necessarily talk about demons.
Right.
So in that sense, it became, you know, as part of a widespread program of, you know, sciences presented through the framework of natural philosophy in Europe from the 12th century onward. And so, yeah, I think it's this context that this enthusiasm to Arabic natural philosophy that takes place in the 12th century and later on as well, that creates a space for the influence of the Ghayat al-Hakim, but also sponsorship, like, for example, by Alfonso X and his groups and his setting, where, you know, they were seeking this kind of texts and translating them, and so it's a different context, and it's not symmetrical at all when it comes to the history of the reception of the Picatrix. Yeah.
And when a text is translated, there's always going to be a bit of interpretation and modifying. I would imagine that someone translating the Ghaya to Latin would perhaps want to sort of put away some of the references to more Islamic themes, perhaps, if those are prominent in the work. I'm not sure. But what I want to ask you is, I guess, how different is the Latin Picatrix from the original Ghaya?
I really recommend reading an article that was written by Jean-Patrice Baudet and Jean-Jacques Coulon, and it is literally about the differences between the Latin and the Arabic. And there are differences, although I don't think that the differences warrant to say that they were completely different texts, but there was, of course, some interruptions that are done by the translator, because, as you said, it's not just translation of words, it's translation from one culture to another, and that's still the case, of course, today. So because we talked about that weird chapter 4 of book 3, I think, I'm not sure either, I think I'm more towards book 3 than book 2, but it's the one where there's reference to a book by Ja'far al-Basri and to some letters practices. So the Latin author basically puts the heading, like he retains the heading for this chapter, but then in one sentence he goes like, in that chapter there's this obscure material that there's no need to put it here, and so he does not include the chapter. And you can speculate about the reasons. It's because compared to the rest of the chapters, it is the most quote-unquote Islamic chapter, because it's talking about Sufi practices, it's talking about the greatest name of God, so possibly it's one of the reasons, or that was not particularly included in the Latin translation. But also there is like interesting bits that were also removed. So and as the article by Jean-Patrice Baudet and Jean-Jacques Coulon point out, so like there are references to magic that is connected to the Buddha, and there is like descriptions of the Buddha, and then in the Latin Picatrix, I think it's just reduced into a wise man in India. And I think they do speculate that this perhaps is because the context of the Buddha was not so interesting or well known. I don't know. So that was like condensed. I think the story about the divining head is not present, I think, or at least not completely described in the Latin context. There are some Sabian context. Sorry.
I was just saying, I don't think I'm familiar with that story or that part.
It's this part is mentioned not just in the Picatrix, but it was like mentioned in other sources as well, which is this ritual of putting a boy who resembles, in some narratives like Ibn Nadim, I think, described the boy as looking like Mars, like has the features of Mars, a Martian
the
physiognomy, whereas in the Picatrix the boy has a mercurial physiognomy.
Okay.
And then this boy is is placed inside a huge container up to here that has sesame oil and other types of oils, and he stays in this container that becomes blocked up to here for a particular number of days, and these oils basically loosen the joints and loosens the skin in such a gradual way that the boy does not die, but you can actually grab the head and pull it out easily, and
Oh,
then you
wow.
place it in a niche, and that boy is not dead, but he turns into an oracle that is able to tell people about prices of crops, and also other future events. And if I remember correctly, in the Latin, the details, at least the details of this ritual is not there, but I could be wrong. I'm not completely sure. Also, a lot, not a lot, but some chapters are rearranged in the Latin contexts, and there's also a reference to a suffumigation apparently taken from the Torah of Moses, and in this context, the reference is either truncated or removed. I'm not sure, but the reason is not clear. But if I remember correctly, Jean-Jacques Coulon and Jean-Patrice Boudet believe that perhaps for the Christian translator, referring to the Torah and the context of in the context of magic, maybe he found that a little bit dodgy. So they were this kind of like interruptions, but as they also say, it doesn't amount to like a qualitative disruption, I think, of the text.
So the core of the text remains essentially the same.
I think so, yes.
Yeah. We have a couple of translations of the Picatrix, at least into English, right? But my question for you then, Dr. Saif, is there any translation of the Arabic original?
I mean, there are some translations out there, but there are not necessarily critical translations. And so, as many of you know, and probably are annoyed with the fact that it's been taking me quite long to finish my own translation of the Picatrix. And this is a combination of life, work, but also 24 manuscripts, plus other manuscripts that I'm not even going to collate because that's going to take more time. But I'm at the end. I'm almost at the end of the last edit. So there's no more collation, which is what was taking a long time. And so I will be done with the Picatrix by the end of this year and then submitted. And yeah.
That is amazing.
Almost sure that will be the trajectory. And then after that, it's going to go through, of course, peer review process and more editing. But it's just I wanted to make sure that I present a translation that is accessible, and that is, I know it's highly anticipated. So I wanted to make sure that it's as critical as I can make it to be. It's looking at, it does use the Helmut Ritter translation, but as one text among a cluster of other manuscripts, because the Helmut Ritter edition does not have a critical apparatus and it does not have an introduction. They make up for that in the German edition a little bit, but I basically used 24 manuscripts in addition to the Ritter's edition, and I do point out in the footnotes, in the rare times when the Ritter edition gets something wrong, and I point out these errors, and so this is what's taken a lot of the time. So I want it to be as critical as possible of an edition, but also as accessible as possible.
It's no doubt going to be a monumental moment for the study of Islamicate Occult Sciences, and just I think I speak for everyone. We are incredibly excited to get our hands on that translation. And
me too. I'm excited for it to be out. I'm kind of excited about having a little break. I love it. Don't get me wrong. I love the Picatrix. But I'm ready to unleash it to the world. Yeah.
We're looking forward to that so much.
Thank you so much.
Before I let you go, is there anything that you are, aside from this translation, obviously, which is perhaps the main project, but is there anything else that you're working on right now that you want to share or that you want to promote?
Yeah, sure. Currently, I am really focused on the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, and this is an Arabic, probably 9th century corpus that presents what we can describe as Hermetic knowledge mediated by Aristotelian framework. They take the shape of text and letters written by Aristotle to Alexander the Great. And Aristotle claims that this is knowledge that he'd received from books written by Hermes himself. And this is one of the main sources, and I would say one of the most influential sources of Ghayat al-Hakim. And this is going to be the subject of my second book, which I am my second monograph, which is going to be completely dedicated to the doctrines, the cosmology, the influence, and the curiosity and the curious nature about the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. So the Picatrix will be back, but by focusing on the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica.
That's also incredibly exciting. We'll have to have you back on the channel to talk about that when in the future, perhaps.
Sure.
But for now, thank you so much, Dr. Saif, for talking to me today. It's been such a fascinating conversation that I've been looking forward to for a long time.
Me too.
And good luck with the translation in the final stretch here, as well as all your other future projects.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me the space and the platform to do this and nerd out more about the Ghayat.
Yeah, it's my pleasure and honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. See you soon.